Do you know what the true sound of despair is? It isn't the scream of a dying man, nor the whistle of an incoming 88mm shell. It is the high-pitched, grinding shriek of a transmission tearing itself apart, while six wheels spin helplessly in waist-deep mud going absolutely nowhere. Let's step into the world of World War II through the story I'm about to tell. Don't forget to like and share. Northern Italy, late 1944. The Gothic line. They called it the soft underbelly of Europe, but whoever coined that phrase had never tried to drive a 2.5-ton truck up the northern face of the Apennines in a freezing downpour. The mud here wasn't just dirt and water. It was a living, malevolent entity. The Italians called it fango, a thick, clay-like glue that swallowed boots, tires, and hope with equal indifference. Private First Class Tex Willow was 19 years old, and at this precise moment, he was sweating profusely despite the temperature hovering near freezing. His knuckles were white, gripping the massive steering wheel of his GMC CCKW 353. The windshield wipers were fighting a losing battle against the sleet, smearing gray sludge across his field of vision. "Come on, you pig," Tex whispered, his Texas drawl trembling slightly. "Don't you quit on me now. Don't you dare." The truck, affectionately known as the Jimmy by the GIs, was the workhorse of the U.S. Army. It was a marvel of Detroit mass production, rugged, reliable, and tough. But the track they were attempting to navigate, a goat path carved into the side of Monte Castello known ominously as Snake's Back, was never meant for Detroit steel. It was a nightmare of jagged limestone rocks hidden beneath a foot of slurry. Ahead of Tex, the lead truck, a Studebaker US-6 driven by a corporal from New Jersey, suddenly lurched. The right rear wheels hit a submerged boulder. In a sane world, on a flat road, the suspension would absorb the bump. But here, on a 20-degree incline, physics turned cruel. The rigid chassis of the Studebaker, designed for heavy loads on paved supply routes, refused to twist. The frame remained stiff. Consequently, the left rear wheels, the ones that needed to grip the slippery earth, lifted 6 inches into the air. With the differential open, all the torque from the screaming Hercules engine took the path of least resistance. It bypassed the wheels touching the ground and surged into the suspended wheels, sending them spinning wildly in the empty air. The Studebaker lost all forward momentum. Gravity took over. "Brakes! Hit the brakes!" Tex screamed inside his own cab, slamming his foot down as he saw the truck ahead begin to slide backward, straight toward his grill. The convoy came to a shuddering, chaotic halt. Engines roared in protest, clutches smoked, and the air filled with the acrid smell of burnt rubber and unburnt fuel. Watching from the side of the trail, standing ankle-deep in the freezing slush, was Technical Sergeant Elias Thorne. He didn't look like a soldier. He looked like a mechanic who had been drafted against his will and was still angry about it. His uniform was stained permanently black with oil, and an unlit, half-chewed cigar was clamped firmly between his teeth. Thorne narrowed his eyes, watching the lead truck flounder. He didn't see a military failure. He saw a mechanical limitation. "It's the articulation," Thorne muttered to himself, the words lost in the roar of the rain. "The damn frame is too stiff. It's lifting a leg like a pissing dog." A jeep skidded to a halt next to Thorne, spraying mud onto his trousers. He didn't flinch. Lieutenant Colonel Bradley Vance jumped out. Vance was a West Point man, sharp-featured and usually composed, but the stress of the last 3 days was etched into the deep lines around his eyes. The 2nd Battalion was pinned down on the summit, low on ammo, and the Germans were tightening the noose. "Thorne!" Vance barked, his voice cutting through the noise. "Why are we stopped? Get that Studebaker moving. We have to clear the pass before the fog lifts and the crowd artillery spotters wake up." Thorne slowly turned to the colonel, wiping a smear of grease from his cheek. "It's not going anywhere, sir. Not unless you can change the laws of physics." "Don't give me engineering lectures, Sergeant," Vance snapped, pointing up the treacherous, winding trail that disappeared into the mist. "I have 500 men up there fighting with bayonets and rocks. They need those crates of .30 caliber ammo. Push it if you have to." "Pushing won't help when you have zero traction, Colonel," Thorne said, his voice flat and calm, contrasting with Vance's panic. He gestured toward the stuck truck. "Look at the rear bogie. The suspension travel is maxed out. As soon as one wheel hits a rock higher than 8 inches, the opposite wheel loses contact. It's floating. No contact, no grip. No grip, we slide." As if to punctuate his point, the driver of the lead truck panicked. He gunned the engine in a desperate attempt to regain traction. The spinning wheels churned the mud into a frenzy, digging a deeper hole until the differential housing slammed onto a rock with a sickening crack. The sound echoed off the valley walls like a gunshot. The truck groaned and settled heavily, listing dangerously toward the sheer drop-off on the left. "Damn it!" Vance kicked the tire of the Jeep, his face flushing red. Thorne walked over to the crippled beast. He squatted down, ignoring the freezing water soaking into his knees, and inspected the undercarriage. The axle housing was fractured. Differential fluid began to bleed out, mixing with the mud in a rainbow swirl. "She's done," Thorne announced, standing up. "Broken axle shaft. We can't tow it up and we can't push it. It's a 2-ton paperweight blocking the only road up the mountain." Tex Willow jumped down from his truck behind the wreck, his face pale. "Sarge, I almost slid off the edge just sitting still. The brakes are locking up, but the tires are just sledding on the mud." Vance ran a hand through his wet hair, knocking his helmet askew. He looked up at the invisible peak where his men were dying. The radio in his Jeep crackled to life. A frantic voice from the summit, distorted by static. "Command, this is Baker 2, taking heavy fire. We are down to, repeat, we are empty." The colonel looked at Thorne, his eyes pleading. "Elias, there has to be a way. We have the trucks, we have the engines. Why can't we climb a damn hill?" Thorne looked at the line of GMCs and Studebakers, magnificent machines on the highways of France, but utterly defeated by the ancient, rugged spine of Italy. He spat a piece of tobacco onto the ground. "Because we're trying to drive bricks up a staircase, sir," Thorne said, a dark realization forming in his mind. "These trucks are built for the Red Ball Express. They're built for speed on flat roads. They have rigid spines. Up here, the mountain breaks anything that doesn't bend." "So we're beaten?" Vance asked, his voice hollow. "By mud?" Thorne looked at the crippled truck, then at the steep, rocky terrain that looked more like the surface of the moon than a road. His eyes traced the movement of a spider crawling effortlessly over the jagged rocks nearby, its legs adjusting independently to every bump and crevice. "Not beaten, sir," Thorne said, a dangerous glint appearing in his eyes. "Just ill-equipped." He turned to look at the motor pool tent down in the valley, where the welding torches were waiting. "We don't need trucks, Colonel. Trucks are for hauling groceries." "Then what do we need?" Thorne bit down on his cigar, staring at the impossible slope. "We need a mountain goat made of steel," he muttered. "Get the men to offload the ammo to the jeeps and mules for now. It won't be enough, but it buys me time." "Time for what?" Vance asked. "Time to perform surgery," Thorne replied, turning his back on the wreck. "I'm going to the workshop. Don't disturb me unless the Germans are actually in the perimeter." As Thorne walked away, the rain intensified, washing away the blood of the differential fluid, but the image of the spider remained burned into his retina. The Standard Issue war was over. It was time for innovation born of desperation. Why is it that we build machines to conquer the Earth, yet design them as if the Earth were flat? It is a question that usually belongs to philosophers, but at 0200 hours in a freezing repair depot south of Bologna, it became a question of life and death. The motor pool was a generous name for what was essentially a bombed-out Italian silk factory. The roof was missing in 3 places, allowing the sleet to hiss as it hit the hot metal of cooling engines. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of welding ozone, stale coffee, and the pervasive, damp rot of the European winter. Sergeant Elias Thorne was not sleeping. He was staring at the rusty, scarred flank of a wrecked Dodge WC-54 ambulance, specifically at its suspension springs. In his hand, a piece of white chalk danced frantically across the wooden surface of an empty 105mm howitzer shell crate. "Hold the light steady, Tex," Thorne growled, not looking up. Private Tex Willow shivered, adjusting the heavy electric lantern. "Sarge, with all due respect, the colonel said we need to prep the mules. Why are we drawing pictures? Mules don't need spark plugs. Mules also can't carry 2 tons of high-explosive mortar rounds up a 45-degree incline in under an hour," Thorne muttered, sketching a rough geometric shape. "And if we don't get that speed, the boys on the hill are going to be overrun by dawn. Mules are too slow. We need horsepower, but applied differently." Thorne tapped the chalk against the wood, leaving a puff of white dust. "Look at this, Tex. What do you see?" Tex squinted at the crude drawing. It looked like a ladder that had been broken in half. "I see a broken truck axle, Sarge." "Exactly. Thorne said, his eyes gleaming with a manic intensity. You see broken. I see articulation. He pointed to the drawing. The standard GMC Jimmy has a solid rear axle. It's a rigid beam. It's strong, sure. If you're hauling crates from the beach at Normandy to Paris on a paved road, it's perfect. But on that mountain, it's suicide. Thorne grabbed 2 wrenches from the bench and held them parallel, connected by a stiff metal rod. This is a solid axle. When the left wheel hits a rock, he tilted the left wrench up. The right wheel is forced down. But because the frame of the truck is stiff and the springs are stiff, the right wheel doesn't push down hard enough. It just hangs there. It floats. 0 friction. 0 traction. The differential spins the floating wheel, and you're stuck. So the truck is too tough? Tex asked, trying to wrap his head around the paradox. It's too stiff, Thorne corrected. It fights the terrain instead of working with it. We don't need a brick. We need a spine. He threw the wrenches down with a clang that echoed through the cavernous factory. He moved back to the crate and drew a large V shape. We cut the axles, Thorne whispered, the idea crystallizing. We cut the housing right here next to the differential pumpkin. We install U-joints, heavy-duty ones, maybe from the drive shaft of that wrecked P-47 Thunderbolt out back. We turn the solid beam into a swing arm. Tex's eyes widened. You want to saw the axle in half? The truck will collapse. Not if we reinforce the pivot points, Thorne said, his voice rising with excitement. Instead of leaf springs that just bounce up and down, we use coil springs from the Dodge ambulance. We mount them high. This way, the rear 4 wheels, they become independent. The left rear can be in a ditch, the right rear can be on a boulder, and the chassis stays level. The wheels reach down to find the ground. Like a spider, Tex breathed. Like a spider, Thorne agreed. A 6-legged mechanical spider. The sound of heavy boots crunching on gravel announced the arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Vance. He stormed into the circle of light, shaking wet snow from his trench coat. He looked exhausted, his patience worn thinner than the tread on a retreating jeep. Thorne, Vance barked. I don't hear engines running. I see you giving art lessons. I just got off the radio with Division. They're telling me to pull back. They say Monte Castello is lost if we can't resupply. And since we can't resupply, we have to abandon the position. Vance's voice cracked slightly. I have to order a retreat, Elias, because we can't get up that damn rock. Thorne stood up slowly, wiping chalk dust onto his greasy trousers. He looked the colonel in the eye. The hierarchy of rank seemed to dissolve in the face of mechanical truth. Don't make that call yet, Colonel. I don't have a choice, Vance snapped, slamming his hand on the workbench. The engineers say the road is impassable for vehicles. The mules will take 6 hours to get up there, and the Germans attack in 3. Mathematics is not on our side. Then change the equation, Thorne said calmly. He pointed to the chalk drawing. Sir, the problem isn't the road. The problem is the truck. You give me 12 hours, and I will give you a machine that can climb walls. Vance looked down at the scribbles. What the hell is this? It looks like a suspension nightmare. It's an independent, multi-link articulating rear bogie, Thorne recited, tossing terms he was inventing on the fly. I'm going to cannibalize the battered bastard, that GMC with the blown cab. I'll strip it to the frame. No cab, no doors, no windshield. Just engine, seat, and this suspension. Vance rubbed his temples. Elias, you're talking about redesigning a Detroit truck in a field in Italy with scrap metal. If the axle snaps halfway up, you block the only retreat route for the men coming down. You kill them all. And if I don't try, Thorne countered, stepping closer. They die anyway. They have no bullets, Colonel. Retreating under fire without ammo is a massacre. You know that. The silence that followed was heavy. The distant rumble of artillery provided a grim rhythm to their standoff. Vance looked at the young driver, Tex, who was watching Thorne with a mixture of fear and awe. Then he looked at Thorne, a man who could fix a tank with a can opener and chewing gum. You're talking about a Frankenstein monster, Vance whispered. It's against every regulation in the field manual. The manual was written in Washington, sir, Thorne said, lighting his cigar for the first time that night. The flame illuminated the hard lines of his face. Washington isn't climbing Snake's back. We are. Vance stared at the diagram for a long moment. He saw the logic in the madness. The rigid trucks failed because they were arrogant. They demanded the ground be flat. Thorne's idea was humble. It adapted to the chaos. 12 hours, Vance said, his voice low and dangerous. Not a minute more. If that thing doesn't move by 1400 hours, I'll have you court-martialed for destroying government property, assuming we survive. Thorne didn't smile. He just nodded. Get me the cutting torch, Tex, and go wake up the welding crew. Tell them we're building a monster. Which truck, Sarge? Tex asked, already grabbing the acetylene tank. Thorne turned to look at the shadows in the corner of the factory, where the carcass of a GMC CCKW 353 lay waiting. That one, Thorne said. The one with the soul. As Vance walked away to delay the retreat order, the blue hiss of the cutting torch ignited, slicing through the dark night. The sparks showered down like fireworks, signaling the beginning of a surgery that would either save a battalion or doom them all. The concept was insane, impossible, and desperate. It was perfect. In a world bent on tearing everything apart, flesh, stone, and steel, is there any greater act of defiance than taking the broken pieces and forging them into something new, something that refuses to die? The workshop was no longer a shelter. It was an inferno of industry. For the next 10 hours, the war outside ceased to exist for Sergeant Thorne and his crew. There was only the metal, the fire, and the clock. "Strip it!" Thorne roared, his voice cracking over the hiss of pressurized gas. "If it doesn't make the truck go or stop, it's gone. We're shaving pounds to gain traction." The battered bastard, a GMC CCKW that had survived a landmine in Sicily, was being flayed alive. Tex Willow and a team of grease-stained privates attacked the chassis like vultures. The steel cab, the doors, the windshield, the passenger seats. Everything was unbolted or torched off. Within an hour, the truck was unrecognizable. It was a skeleton, a naked ladder frame, a massive engine block, a steering column jutting up into the empty air, and a single iron seat welded directly to the frame rail. It looked vulnerable. It looked fast. Then came the surgery. Thorne pulled his goggles down. "Cutting the rear housing now. Don't look at the arc." The blue flame of the acetylene torch kissed the heavy steel of the rear axle. Sparks showered down like molten rain, bouncing off Thorne's leather apron. He wasn't just cutting, he was severing the truck's rigid connection to the old world. With a final clang, the solid axle beam fell away. Now the truck had no rear legs. "Bring me the Dodge springs," Thorne shouted. This was the madness Vance had feared. Thorne and his welders began grafting the independent suspension arms onto the frame. They used heavy coil springs scavenged from the ambulance, mounting them high on the chassis. Instead of a stiff bar connecting the wheels, each wheel hub was now attached to a swing arm that could move freely. "Look at it," Tex whispered, holding a pry bar. "It looks broken, Sarge. It's hanging too low." "It's not broken, Tex. It's reaching," Thorne grunted, wiping sweat that had turned black with soot. "Push that wheel up." Tex shoved the pry bar under the left rear wheel hub and heaved. The wheel rose 2 feet into the air, compressing the spring, but the rest of the truck frame didn't tilt an inch. The other 3 rear wheels stayed planted firmly on the concrete. "Holy hell," Tex breathed. "It walks." "It crawls," Thorne corrected, but he wasn't done. "It needs claws." He pointed to a pile of rusted tracks taken from a destroyed German SDKFZ 251 half-track. "We can't put full tracks on it, too heavy, but we can armor the tires." They cut the German tracks into sections and welded the steel links directly across the dual rear tires of the GMC. It was a brutal, ugly modification. The rubber tires were now caged in jagged steel teeth, designed to bite into rock and ice where rubber would only slip. The night wore on. The noise was deafening. Grinding wheels screaming against metal, hammers pounding rivets, the constant hiss of welding. The men moved like zombies, fueled only by fear and bad coffee. By 0500, the noise stopped. Silence rushed back into the factory, heavier than before. The smoke cleared slowly, revealing the creation in the center of the bay. It was hideous. It was a mechanical abomination. Without a body, the engine sat exposed like a beating heart. The exhaust pipe had been shortened and turned upward, looking like a chimney. But the most striking feature was the rear end. The 4 rear wheels, wrapped in their steel chains, drooped at odd angles, looking like the legs of a giant arachnid waiting to pounce. "It's a monster," a private whispered, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's Frankenstein," another muttered. Thorne walked around the machine. He checked the welds. He kicked the tires. He ran his hand over the exposed transmission case. He climbed up the frame, there was no door to open, and sat on the lone iron seat. It was high, exposed to the wind and bullets. He turned the key. The engine didn't just start, it exploded into life. Without the muffler and the weight of the body to dampen the vibration, the raw power of the 270 cubic inch engine shook the concrete floor. The crawler vibrated with a predatory energy. Thorne looked at Tex. The boy's face was smeared with grease, his eyes wide with a mix of terror and exhilaration. "Tex!" Thorne shouted over the roar of the engine. "Load the ammo. Weld the crates to the frame if you have to. We leave in 10 minutes. "Does it have a name, Sarge?" Tex yelled back. Thorne revved the engine. The rear suspension squatted and shifted, the steel chain tires digging gouges into the factory floor even while stationary. "Yeah," Thorne said, spitting his cigar onto the floor. "The Spider." They say the line between genius and madness is measured only by success. But standing in the freezing dawn of a war zone, watching a pile of scrap metal shudder to life, how do you distinguish a savior from a suicide machine? The dawn light over the Apennines was gray and unforgiving, revealing the Spider in all its grotesque glory. It sat on the edge of the motor pool's testing ground, a chaotic acre of bomb craters, collapsed brick walls, and mud that had swallowed lesser vehicles whole. Lieutenant Colonel Vance stood with his arms crossed, his breath steaming in the frigid air. Behind him, a platoon of infantrymen stared. They didn't look hopeful. They looked like they were witnessing a prank. The machine before them was an insult to military order. It had no cabin, no windshield, no doors. It was a naked steel skeleton with an exposed engine and a driver's seat that looked like a throne of iron welded to a raft. The rear wheels, wrapped in jagged steel chains, sat at odd, droopy angles, like the broken limbs of a crushed insect. "That's it?" Vance asked, his voice flat. "That's your miracle, Sergeant?" "That's the Spider, sir," Thorne replied. He didn't salute. He just pulled his goggles down over his eyes and climbed onto the exposed seat. "It looks like a death trap," a soldier muttered. "Watch," Thorne said. He fired the engine. The roar was barbaric, devoid of any muffler to soften the explosions of the 6 cylinders. Thorne slammed the gear stick into low range and dropped the clutch. The Spider didn't lurch, it crept. Thorne drove straight toward the graveyard, a pile of rubble from a demolished bell tower, a mix of jagged limestone and wet mortar rising 6 feet high at a sharp angle. A standard Jeep would bottom out. A standard truck would tip over. Thorne didn't slow down. "He's going to flip it," Tex Willow whispered, covering his mouth. The front wheels hit the base of the rubble. The Spider climbed. Then came the test. Thorne steered the right side of the truck directly over a massive waist-high block of concrete, while the left side dipped into a muddy crater. In a normal truck, the frame would have twisted. The left rear wheel would have hung in the air spinning helplessly, and the vehicle would have rolled onto its side. But the Spider did something unnatural. As the right rear wheel rode up the concrete block, the independent coil spring compressed completely, tucking the wheel high into the frame. Simultaneously, the swing arm on the left side pushed down, extending the wheel deep into the crater until the chain tire bit into the mud. The chassis didn't roll, it floated. The crowd of soldiers gasped. It was an optical illusion. The wheels were dancing violently up and down, thrashing over the uneven terrain. But Thorne sat perfectly level in the center, calm as a statue. The steel chains on the tires dug into the wet stone with a sickening crunch, finding grip where there should be none. The truck crested the pile of rubble. It paused at the top, silhouetted against the gray sky, looking less like a machine and more like a living creature surveying its territory. Thorne shifted gears and brought the beast down the other side, the suspension absorbing a drop that would have snapped a standard axle in two. He spun the vehicle around in the mud, throwing a rooster tail of black sludge, and roared back to where the colonel stood. He killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy with awe. Thorne looked down from his high seat, his face splattered with mud, the unlit cigar still clenched in his teeth. "It doesn't care about the road, Colonel," Thorne said. "It makes its own." Vance walked up to the machine. He reached out and touched the warm, vibrating steel of the exposed frame. He looked at the impossible suspension, then up at the impossible mountain looming in the distance. The skepticism in his eyes had vanished, replaced by the cold, hard calculation of a commander who finally had a weapon. "Load it," Vance ordered, his voice cutting through the morning air like a whip. "Every mortar shell we have. Stack them until the springs sag." "Sir." Tex Willow stepped forward, his fear replaced by a sudden, reckless pride. "I'm riding shotgun. Someone needs to keep the ammo from sliding off. Vance nodded. Get moving. You have a mountain to conquer. As the men rushed to load the crates of explosives onto the naked frame of the Spider, Thorne relit his cigar. The test was over. The physics worked. Now, all that remained was the enemy. If the path to salvation leads through the valley of the shadow of death, what happens when the valley runs out of ground and forces you to climb the walls? The snake's back was not a road. It was a scar etched into the granite face of Monte Castello. To the left was a vertical wall of cold stone. To the right, a 1,000-foot drop into a white abyss of fog and jagged pine trees. There was no windshield to protect Sergeant Thorne from the biting wind. There were no doors to hide his trembling legs. There was only the roar of the engine and the terrifying, unobstructed view of the edge. "Don't look down, Tex," Thorne yelled over the deafening clatter of the chains on stone. "Watch the temperature gauge. If she overheats, we're dead." Perched on a crate of 60mm mortar shells welded to the passenger side of the frame, Private Tex Willow gripped the roll bar with hands that had lost all feeling. "It's pinned at 190, Sarge. She's running hot." "She likes it hot." Thorne gritted his teeth, wrestling the steering wheel. The Spider was performing miracles. Where the Studebakers had spun their wheels and died, the Spider clawed its way upward. The independent rear suspension was a mesmerizing blur of violence. The wheels danced. When a rock jutted out, a wheel retracted up into the frame, swallowing the bump. When a pothole appeared, a wheel shot down, finding traction in the mud. The chassis remained unnervingly flat, carrying its volatile cargo of high explosives with the grace of a tightrope walker. But the Germans were not blind. A high-pitched whistle pierced the air, distinct from the wind. "Incoming!" Tex screamed, curling into a ball. Whomp! A mortar shell slammed into the cliff face 50 yards ahead, showering the trail with shale and dust. Then another. Then a third. Closer this time, shaking the very ground beneath their tires. "They have the range!" Thorne shouted. He didn't hit the brakes. He stomped on the gas. "Hold on!" The Spider surged forward. A normal truck would have bounced off the trail at this speed, but the Spider's active legs soaked up the terrain, keeping the tires planted. They were racing the bracket of artillery fire. Then the nightmare scenario unfolded. The explosion ahead had not just scattered debris, it had sheared off the outer 3 feet of the trail. The road simply ended, narrowed to a sliver of rock barely wide enough for a jeep, let alone a 6-wheeled truck. There was no room to stop, no room to turn. "Sarge, the road!" Tex yelled, staring at the gap. "I see it." Thorne made a split-second calculation. If he hugged the cliff wall too tight, the front hub would catch, and they would spin out. If he went too wide, gravity would take them. "Trust the machine," Thorne whispered to himself. He steered the Spider straight at the gap. The front wheels cleared the narrow patch of solid ground. But as the rear of the truck passed over, the outer edge of the trail crumbled under the weight. The ground vanished beneath the right rear wheels. In any other vehicle in the U.S. Army inventory, this was the moment of death. A rigid axle would have acted like a lever. As the right side dropped, it would have pulled the left side up, flipping the truck into the void. But the Spider was not rigid. Time seemed to slow. As the earth gave way, the right rear suspension arm swung down, extending fully. The wheels dropped 2 feet below the level of the road, dangling over the abyss, but the chassis did not tilt. The left rear wheels, planted firmly on the solid rock near the cliff wall, carried the weight. The independent joint absorbed the shift. The Spider teetered. The right rear tires spun in empty air, chains flailing against the mist. "Lean left," Thorne roared, throwing his body weight toward the cliff. The engine screamed in low gear. The left side tires, biting into the stone with their steel chains, dragged the entire weight of the truck forward. With a groan of tortured metal, the Spider pulled itself past the gap, dragging its fallen legs back onto solid ground. Tex let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He looked back. The road behind them was gone. "We're still alive," Tex stammered, checking his body as if surprised to find it intact. "We're not there yet," Thorne said, his eyes fixed on the smoke-shrouded peak ahead. They burst through the cloud layer. The sun hit them suddenly, blinding and bright. Ahead lay the foxholes of the 2nd Battalion. But between them and the starving infantry was the final defensive line of the enemy. A machine gun nest dug into the scree, turning its barrel toward the strange skeletal beast charging up the hill. Thorne didn't slow down. He didn't swerve. He drove the Spider straight at the muzzle flashes, a mechanical demon rising from the clouds. When the guns finally fall silent and history hardens into marble statues of generals, who remembers the rusted iron bones that actually carried victory up the mountain? The Spider did not look like a hero. It looked like a nightmare birthed from a junkyard. As it crested the final ridge, the German MG-42 machine gun crew turned their weapon toward the noise. They expected a jeep, or perhaps a squad of infantry. What they saw froze their fingers on the trigger. Emerging from the cloud bank was a skeletal beast, roaring with the fury of an unmuffled engine. It didn't use the road. Thorne steered the Spider directly up the shale embankment flanking the machine gun nest, a slope of 40 degrees that no vehicle should have been able to grip. The independent rear suspension worked violently. The left wheels compressed into the wheel wells, while the right wheels extended down like talons, hooking into the loose rock. The chain-wrapped tires tore at the earth, throwing up a curtain of stone. "Get some!" Tex Willow screamed, firing his Thompson submachine gun from the passenger seat, though he was shaking so hard he likely didn't hit a thing. The sheer audacity of the assault broke the enemy's nerve. This wasn't a tank. It was a mechanical demon that refused to obey the laws of physics. The German gunners abandoned their position moments before the Spider crushed their sandbags, vaulting over the trench with a metallic screech of triumph. Thorne slammed the brakes. The Spider skidded to a halt in the center of the American perimeter. Silence. For a heartbeat, the beleaguered soldiers of the 2nd Battalion stared from their foxholes. They were haggard, eyes hollowed by 3 days of sleepless fighting, their rifles empty. They looked at the naked chassis, the exposed engine steaming in the cold air, and the 2 grease-stained maniacs sitting on top of a mountain of wooden crates. "Delivery from the motor pool!" Thorne's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but it carried across the clearing. "It's ammo!" a sergeant screamed, his voice cracking. "They brought ammo!" The spell broke. Dozens of soldiers scrambled out of the mud, rushing the vehicle. They didn't cheer. They didn't have the energy. They simply clawed at the ropes, passing the heavy crates of mortar shells and .30 caliber rounds down the line like bucket brigades at a fire. Within minutes, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of American 60mm mortars began to cough from the pits. The M1 Garands began to bark again. The mountain, which had been slipping from their grasp, was suddenly, violently, reclaiming its ground. Thorne slumped over the steering wheel. His hands were locked in a claw-like grip, cramped from the vibration. He reached down to turn off the ignition, but the engine had already died. A hairline fracture had opened in the engine block. Dark oil pooled on the frozen ground beneath the chassis, spreading slowly like blood. The Spider had given everything. It had climbed the unclimbable, and in doing so, it had destroyed itself. Lieutenant Colonel Vance came up the trail hours later on foot, leading the mules that could finally pass safely. He found Thorne sitting on a rock next to the cooling carcass of the truck, smoking the rest of his cigar. Vance looked at the vehicle. The suspension was sagged, the springs broken, the tires shredded. "You did it, Elias," Vance said softly. "You saved the battalion." Thorne didn't look up. He patted the cold steel of the frame. "She was a good truck, Colonel. She didn't want to be a truck. She wanted to be a climber." 70 years later, if you go to the Apennines today, the mud is gone, replaced by wildflowers and hiking trails. The scars of the Gothic line are covered by moss. In museums, you can see the pristine Shermans and the restored Jeeps, polished to a shine they never had in 1944. But if you look closely at the evolution of off-road technology, if you look at the rock crawlers in Moab, the Mars rovers exploring the Red Planet, or the extreme rescue vehicles that go where no road exists, you will see the ghost of the Spider. You will see the independent axles. You will see the articulation. You will see the engineering DNA that was born not in a clean laboratory, but in a freezing, muddy tent in Italy, forged by men who refused to accept that a mountain could tell them no. We often think of freedom as an abstract concept, won by speeches and treaties. We forget that sometimes freedom hangs on the ability of a single, ugly, broken machine to turn a wheel just one more time in the mud. Thorne and Tex are gone now. The Spider was likely scrapped, melted down to build the bridges and skyscrapers of the post-war boom. But on that morning, on the peak of Monte Castello, they proved a truth that echoes through every garage and workshop to this day. It is not the strength of the steel that conquers the mountain. It is the spirit of the mechanic who dares to bend it.